Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This book review is a little behind. As things stand, I've almost finished the series, at least up to current. But that's a different video and a different format. This will just cover the first book, which was just weird enough to pull me through. But first, a message from this video's sponsor, me. One day I'm going to trick you all and someone's going to give me money to push their stuff. My next book, Battle Games Book 2, is out. If you're interested in a science fiction sports series with stun batons shaped like every weapon under the sun, athletes beating each other up, and a touch of drama and humor, pick it up. I will leave a link to all my work in the description and to my Rumble channel if you'd prefer to watch me over there. One day I'm going to say something arbitrary or insult some executive's kids and my channel may disappear. Back to the book, and let's start with the story. Bob is rich. He recently sold his tech startup to a giant soulless megacorp for a ridiculous amount of money. Enough that he can engage in the favorite pastime of all people with too much money, trying to accrue infinite money and time. Or in other words, being immortal. One could think they could try a vampire, but I'm sure that's a different book. Bob is making arrangements to have his head frozen in the event of his death. He's so serious about it that he's already set up the trust that he's going to use when he wakes up. Ignoring the obvious foreshadowing. Bob leaves the cryo company and returns to good old Las Vegas, where he and the other members of his startup are partying with his newfound riches. Bob's personal celebration involves attending a massive nerd convention because Bob is a massive nerd. If you don't believe me now, trust me, he'll reinforce that later. We get treated to a bit of scenery where the other background nerds are walking around in costumes of famous franchises A through Z. After thoroughly nerding out, Bob meets up with his co-workers for dinner. We're treated to some ribbing about where Bob's life stands and his co-workers. We find out Bob recently went through a bad breakup, we get a touch of his private life, his family life, and then Bob conks out for the night to get an early start on the con the next day. On his way to the con the next day, he's hit by a car. Half-remembered death throes and some gruesome scenes of contract fulfillment that were too grisly to make it into the book later, Bob wakes up. He finds himself in a lab facing someone very strange to him. This man is a doctor. Bob has not been revived as the company he paid had promised. During the century Bob was dead, the US has changed into a theocracy. Bob's wealth was confiscated by the government, and Bob was sold and revived as a replicant. A replicant is a kind of AI construct after destructively copying a human mind. Now Bob is in a race to be the central intelligence in a special space probe called a von Neumann probe, if I'm saying that right, and I won't say it again, that will help humanity colonize the stars in this brave new world. That's where I'll leave off the recap. It's just enough to give some fleshing out to the blurb on the Amazon page. I'm starting to like giving my dislikes first because bad news should always come first, and that's a flimsy reference to something in the book. First of all, I wasn't kidding when I called this Atheist Isekai. This book is really down on religion. We spend about a chapter covering faith, which is either a religious organization or the governing body of the North American continent in this timeline. According to this book, at some point in our near future, the US elects a fundamentalist religious extremist. This president then goes on to basically run the US like a theocracy, crash the economy, and piss everyone off. Then the US elects its first openly atheist president to fix the problem. The fundamentalists didn't like this, so overthrow the entire continent and install a theocracy. This is a Cliff Notes version of what the book covers. We're also reminded of it often, even at points where it's entirely unnecessary. Much of this feels more like the hatred of the author for religion than anything else. This isn't limited to a specific religion. Terrible things seem to have happened to all the major religious areas. This is further cemented when the main character blames much of the lack of technological advancement on religion and not the nuclear war that decimated a big chunk of the largest landmass on Earth. I will give credit where credit is due. The internal fighting among the factions of a theocracy was spot on. No one hates religious people more than other religious people, who are religious, but in a slightly and almost indistinguishably different way. At least this is how it would appear to the uninformed outsider. I blame this more on the human cliquish behavior than anything else, and you can see it in other things like nerd culture as well. You know, any place where different factions fight about who has the best space wizards. Also, a lot of this down on religious stuff feels a bit odd when Bob starts playing God to a group of primitive aliens he finds. This might be something that ends up as growth and understanding of the main character. I really want to believe that. But my faith in modern writing is low, and I don't want to get my hopes up. Much of the hate for religion seems tapped by the end of the book, as if the author only had about half a book's worth of rage to release. I get it. It can be hard to completely separate ourselves from our work. Moving on to a religion of a different kind. Pop culture references. One day I should really do a review of Ready Player One and my hatred for pop culture references. This book isn't as bad as Ready Player One. It's still bad. There's just not massive screeds dedicated to nerding out. It's the difference between slightly over-peppering your eggs and making them into an inedible mess. I have grown to accept pop culture references in modern sci-fi to a point. Most of modernity doesn't seem capable of breaking away from the member berries. If these references had been handled with more subtlety, it could have added flavor to the book. We know Bob is a nerd. We expect it from his profession, and anyone who'd find exploring space alone for years on end would likely be a nerd to the nth degree. That said, it does reach the point of taking me out of the story. It wasn't enough to stop me from reading, and if I wasn't so burnt out from work, I probably would have finished the first book in a single setting. That's a joy I lament long work hours taking from me. Moving away from pop culture and onto the smallest of my complaints, the humor of this book just didn't land for me. It could be that it was intended for a nerd of a much higher order. Most of the time I didn't realize a joke had been made till well after the punchline. One of the reasons I picked this book was because it looked kind of goofy and had a fun hook. I think through the first book I might have laughed twice. One of those was at the word corpsicle, which is still a funny word no matter how often I hear it. The fact that this book was trying to be funny really didn't occur to me till a little past halfway through the book. It's more that it just didn't register with me. Other elements of the book almost completely eclipsed the humor. I guess it's better to have humor that wasn't recognized than humor that made people cringe, but I feel a little let down. That's not to say there isn't a light tone in the book. It's just not a funny book. On to my likes. First of all, this setting is my insert illicit drug here. I am a sucker for base building, starting new life stories, and odd situations with new powers or technology. The humorous setting and title really sold me on the book. Add into that a touch of in-world politics and rivals of parody, and I'll lose myself for a week. I know, I've seen me do it. Bob is a type of self-replicating space probe that I'm going to try to pronounce again called a von Neumann probe. To state another way, Bob is an intelligent machine capable of building anything through printing and machines called roamers, including copies and upgrades of himself. This makes him a weird form of technological life. This is complicated by two other major factors. It's important to understand that what Bob has become has an 80% failure rate as stated at the beginning of the book. Most people can't handle becoming a replicant and end up going mad. Bob is a loner, but he's also an engineer. This type of scenario is his dream. I am a bit troubled by how many protagonists of these kinds of books are engineers, but at least he's working on technology rather than magic. Then there are Bob's clones, which it turns out aren't exactly clones. Bob replicates by copying himself like software. This leads to differences in personality, temperament, and outlook. The book plays this up as a bigger mystery, but it feels more like it's influenced by their situations. His second clone immediately adopts the persona of Will Riker of Star Trek. Almost too much. Riker then clones himself later, and that one adopts the persona of Homer Simpson. This looks more like a study in identity than anything else. To look at it another way, it can be a take on how a name and an area can affect a person. Also, most of the clones take on a pop culture name of some kind, but I've said my piece on that subject. The clones do play a major role. Bob, as capable as he is not all-powerful. He can only do so much at any given time. The clones allow him to cover many more tasks in short order. The clones themselves take a lot of time and resource to build, and in many ways become a resource of their own. Which leads me to my next point. I like logistics. I love the process of moving needed things to where they're supposed to be in a timed manner to facilitate maximum productivity. This book does logistics well. Is it the best I've seen? I'm not prepared to say that. It does make it interesting. Resource, time, and production ability play a big part in the story. Most of Bob's problems come from the time it takes to make what he needs and finding the resources that he will require. Which in itself is interesting to me. It does make me a little concerned for later books when he has the wealth of multiple systems at his disposal. Scaling is as much of a problem in stories as it is in manufacturing, and what works on the small may not work on the big. I do like space colonization in this book. It was a really fun play for me, and the book does it fairly well. One of Bob's major drives for resources is to reproduce and spread out. It does feel organic, and the need is understandable. He also needs to improve his technology. It's nice to see that Bob is not the only one advancing. His enemies become more capable as well, given time and resource. As for the spacefaring, it's handled okay. The times we're dealing with are not monstrous and feel manageable. Most of this is due to Bob being basically immortal, but he's also not the only one who's immortal. And time becomes just another resource that needs to be used judiciously. As for moving humans from one system to the other, we don't cover hundreds of years. I think maybe 40 or 50 years pass in the first book, not counting the time skip at the beginning, and by the end I think Bob has about 12.5 clones. I will applaud the author in the perspectives of each chapter. At the beginning of the book, I was wondering why each chapter was named after the main character. Then we start getting chapters from the clone's point of view, and the chapter names become obvious. The name is giving us the point of view character. This creates an interesting dynamic, as it's the same main character, kind of, in a different location. It's telling us more where we are than who we are. Last in my likes, I have to say, the book did a good job of hooking me in. I'm going to pick up the next book, and if all goes well, I'll drop a series so far review later on. I like the villains, the mystery is well handled, and this is the closest thing to a base building book I've found. Moving on to my thoughts. There are a few things I'm a little off about. First of all, Bob creates a VR space he ends up sharing with his clones. This is to fill the need of having a human body. It's kind of a neat idea, but it's also a source of some annoyance. In some ways it feels practical, and in other ways it feels really unneeded. The most unneeded bits of all fall into the camp of extra scenery. Each Bob clone makes his own personal space, and it's often based off some story first Bob read when he was alive. So while I think it's a cool way for Bob to fix a problem he had, I can see it possibly becoming an issue later in the series. I also want to cover Bob's power scale. I'm pretty sure I talk about this a lot, and it shows how important it can be. Bob is powerful. The book does a good job of showing us that. While he's not exactly overpowered, there are some things that feel wrong to me. One of those is removing the constraints from his own code. It's done a bit too easy and in very short order. I feel like this was a good opportunity for growth in Bob. Having to deal with rogue units of himself, having to barter with old masters, the consequences of losing part of himself, all of this makes a great but kind of subdued threat, as odd as that sounds. It's also possible this extra story element could have overcrowded an already full story. That also brings up the question of why put it in at all. Bob didn't need backdoors installed in his system if he was going to remove them the very chapter he's out of system. If they had been left in, it could have introduced an interesting story element. Or should it have been something he could have only eliminated in his clones, that would have given him some motivation to stay away from the humans. It could have been a very good point of contention. This book is also really tech-heavy. Some of it gave me a bit of trouble keeping up with, but much of these sections I could infer from the surrounding context. While this wasn't a major hindrance, I could see it being annoying to some people. Painting a picture with words is difficult enough. Trying to do it for such an alien environment like space is doubly so. Some sections may require a second glance or a bit of inference from the surrounding descriptions. I didn't find it to be too big of a hindrance. Overall, I like the book, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. As things stand, there are 4 books currently out with a 5th due in September, which you can find in the affiliate link below, assuming I get everything set up in time. I hope the series continues to perform. Good luck, everyone.